Well, like I said, there was 2 Steve Jobs, the good one and the bad one, and we had a little meeting of Apple employees, um, back in the early 2000s, and, I said at the time that if the good Steve Jobs was at Apple when the bad Steve Jobs was there, the company would be 3 times larger, than it is today, and then after the good Steve Jobs came back to Apple and did all the things right, the company is 3 times more valuable than it was, before he came back. It was about to go out of business, in the late 1990s.
Welcome to Beyond the Fail, the podcast where we talk to leaders and entrepreneurs about their biggest business failures. We'll deep dive into how they overcame these setbacks, the lessons they learned from them, all to help you gain valuable insights. Failure is an essential part of the business journey, as well as being the key to success. So we're here to show you how to thrive from it. David, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great and, glad to be with you.
Where are you joining us from?
Silicon Valley, Northern California.
Brilliant. And that leads us on to, I suppose, our first question, really. And you've obviously had a fascinating career, working with some people at the top of their game and working for Apple and HP. But where did it kind of all start?
I was born, and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Went to, Cass Technical High School, which was the top students from all the other junior high schools, in, aeronautical technology. I had joined the Civil Air Patrol when I was, 13 and rose to the level of a captain, which I think I was told was the youngest captain in the Civil Air Patrol, in the nation. Civil Air Patrol was started during World War II to patrol the east and west coasts, by air for enemy, submarines. And later, its mission as an auxiliary of the Air Force has evolved into search and rescue, where we would go out after an airplane crashes and try to find it and try to rescue the people that crashed from that airplane. Um, I then, when I left Cass Tech, I went to aerospace engineering at the University of Michigan and noticed that, to my dismay, the university did not have a flying club. So I and several other people started it, and the club is still going today. University of Michigan Flyers has trained over 5,000 pilots over the last 54 years, and including the head of the Blue Angels flight demonstration team. And then in my sophomore year in college, my aerospace engineering professor, Wilbur Nelson, who was on Lyndon Johnson's Supersonic Transport Committee's advisory committee, came to me and said, I noticed you know how to organize and manage. Would you be interested in putting together a nationwide student organization in support of American SST called Fly America's Supersonic Transporter, FASST? And having no idea what I was getting myself into, I said, sure. And by the time I finished my sophomore year in college, I had about 40 chapters, 15,000 members at universities nationwide. I was raising money from aerospace companies to fund the organization and testified before Congress. I went to meetings at the White House in my pink polyester suit. And ended up for the rest of my college career spending about a year in Washington lobbying Congress to build the space shuttle and to build and develop Project Energy Independence, especially with a focus on alternative energy from coal or oil or natural gas. The So that's what I did, and at the time, there was a feeling that the SST, which is the first transportation aircraft development in the United States funded by the civilian sector, the Department of Transportation, as opposed to the Department of Defense, and it was defeated on a very strong anti-technology feeling. And technology is nothing more than the organization of knowledge for practical purposes. So we changed the name of the student group to Federation of Americans Supporting Science and Technology. And I changed my major at engineering school from aerospace because there was about 150,000 unemployed aerospace engineers after the United States started winding down the space program and the Vietnam War. So I went into a degree field called interdisciplinary technology, which was motivated by Cy Ramo of TRW. That's the R in the TRW name. And he was a man that interacted with his surroundings, with his world through technology, through religion, and through music. And he had convinced the National Science Foundation to fund my degree program. So I was the first of the 7 graduates in interdisciplinary technology, which turned out to be a perfect training for what I later would become a product manager.
Wow, that's and that's obviously the early part of your career as well. So, why why planes? Why aerospace?
I was just interested in flying, and I went to Michigan because I thought they had a good school on aeronautics. Turned out that they had cut a private deal with Ohio State. To let Ohio State focus on aeronautics, and Michigan would focus on space. And I have very little interest in space, primarily because there's nothing up there, and I wanted to fly.
Can you not fly into space? Is that not the same?
I got my private pilot's license before my freshman year in high school, and then after I started the flying club at Michigan, I was able to fly a lot. I got my commercial rating and my flight instructor's rating, and then worked my uh, last 2 years through college as a flight instructor. So I go off and teach in the morning, and the student would get into an inadvertent spin, which was quite exciting. And then I would uh, go back to English grammar class or something like that, which was especially boring.
Yeah, I mean, when you know, when you're up in the air, and obviously flying a plane offshore, everything else pales into insignificance, and obviously everything else is less exciting, isn't it? Particularly kind of, lessons. What did you learn from, you said you spent time in the sort of the military. What did you learn from that?
Uh, I learned about aeronautics and technology, but primarily I learned about leadership. What does it take to be a leader? What are the qualifications for a leader? How to be a leader that people are willing to follow. You can't be a leader unless people are willing to follow you. And then I also learned as a flight instructor that the best way my students learn things is if I let them make mistakes and don't correct it before they make the mistake. They tend to learn more from making mistakes than they learn from doing it right the first time.
But that takes courage, doesn't it, as a leader to do that?
To let go and let people make mistakes.
And where did you see that sort of, at its most effective?
Well, here in Silicon Valley, which I've always wanted to gravitate towards, there are 2 major cultural attributes that it has better than any other place in the world. One is the ease of networking, and 2 is the acceptance of making mistakes. If you have a new product and it fails, hopefully you learn from it and improve, and you're not people are not looked down on, as opposed to a Japanese culture, for example, where you strive to not stick out like a nail, and if you do, then the culture tries to pound that nail down, flush with the board.
Do you think that's just a Silicon Valley culture, or do you think that's American-wide business culture?
Silicon Valley, it's spread a little bit to other areas of the country like Austin, Texas, New York City. Detroit used to be that way with the automotive industry where I grew up in the 50s. It was a go-go economy. It was exploding at the time. A very high employment with good wages. And it was willing to make mistakes. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had things like the Ford Edsel and the Studebaker and a few other cars.
Right. Okay. So that, I mean, in some ways that could be a precursor to, the Silicon Valley uh, culture.
was Silicon Valley was started around computer chips, a company called Fairchild Semiconductor, later Intel, and around Hewlett-Packard, which came out of GE in in New York State, and Packard emigrated to California from there. Went to Stanford Electrical Engineering School. Met a professor by the name of Fred Tierman, is considered by many as the father of Silicon Valley. And he encouraged them to start their own company. And he and five others then started Hewlett-Packard in 1938, copied the brand management model that Procter& and Gamble had, changed the name to product manager, and then that notion of product management has evolved and grown out of HP ever since 1938.
And of course, that's kind of what, you fell into as well. What when did you make that transition into working, within technology and within Silicon Valley?
Well, after I graduated from Michigan, I couldn't find a job because nobody knew what a technically trained manager is. So I moved the student association to Washington, D.C., stayed there for a couple of years, then decided I can't be a student anymore. I'm too old. And I got recruited by the Environmental Balance Association of Minnesota. And I don't know what was wrong with me, but I moved there in January of 1975. I couldn't get out of the car because there was 7 feet of snow along the side of the road, and developed the field of environmental mediation, which is useful in resolving environmental, economic, and energy disputes, as opposed to litigation, which only has a yes, no, guilty, not guilty answer. Mediation allows negotiation to occur amongst the interested parties and come up with an agreed upon solution. And I helped mediate, or actually mediated, the dispute over an Anheuser-Busch malt plant in Moorhead, Minnesota, which Business Week wrote about. And then I was called Henry Kissinger in northern Minnesota for Marshmallow diplomacy to help resolve the reserve mining dispute, which had been going on for seven years at that time, spending millions of dollars in legal fees over the dumping of taconite tailings by reserve mining into Lake Superior. And what they had done is they thought, since the discharge was heavier than water, that these 55,000 tons of taconite tailings would float to the bottom of a crevice there in Lake Superior. Instead, it spread across the surface of Lake Superior, turned to green as a result of the sun reflecting off these particles, and people thought it was an algae bloom on a very cold lake like that. So I helped get that resolved, and then I was asked to run Al Qui's gubernatorial campaign, which coincidentally enough, he was the congressman from the same district that Tim Walz, who's running for vice president now, is from. And we were losing in that election when I took over with a couple, 3 weeks left by 20 percentage points. And because I was able to get surveys done on the importance and saliency of issues, and these kinds of things that I'm talking about now are relevant to product managers, I was able to change the messaging and the frequency, and we ended up winning the election by 10 points.
Yeah.
And then John Connally, who was the former Secretary of Treasury, former governor of Texas, the guy that was sitting in front of the front seat of the car when John F. Kennedy was killed in Dallas. John asked me if I would run his Minnesota campaign, and I agreed. And then we got twice as many, or actually 4 times as many delegates in Minnesota for the party caucuses on the same night as the New Hampshire primary. He got 1 delegate in New Hampshire, and I got 4 delegates for him in Minnesota. So that was the end of that election, and Hewlett-Packard reached out to me. They were having trouble siting new facilities throughout the country, and they asked me to come join their corporate PR department and help with the community relations, as I understood what it takes to site a new facility in a new community. So when I was there at the corporate PR department, I was quite surprised that they did not have any word processing. I had word processing back to my FAST days, and also with the Environmental Balance Association. And also even on the Codling campaign, I had one of the first Xerox 800 word processors. So I introduced into the corporate PR department Slate, a software program that ran on an HP 3000 mini computer and on a terminal, word processing. And it was kind of unique because at the time, this would be 1980, the corporate HP PR offices was the only department in the company that knew how to type. Nobody else knew how to type. And we all, as journalists, had to learn how to type in order to write our stories. So one of the nice things about HP is you could transfer laterally, and I was able to transfer into product management in the information networks division in the office systems group. There, Apple noticed me and they said, "Would you like to come to work for Apple in the peripherals group? And we want you to bring to market the first hard disk drive for a PC." And that was an enormously large hard drive. It was about 3 or 4 inches tall, about 14, 15 inches wide, and about 12 inches deep. It held on the Seagate ST506 disk drive an enormous 5 megabytes of material. It was very cheap. It only cost $3,500.
Wow.
And I had to convince people that they could use all that space. I was pretty successful with that introduction, and management over in the personal computer systems group asked me if I would take over the Apple III product line as a group product manager. And at the time, Apple had two product lines of profitability, the Apple II, which was his first original profitable product, and then the Apple III, which was developed in order to correct the deficiencies that the Apple II had in the office or small, medium business marketplaces.
Mm.
Did that cover the job? Go ahead.
So I was just going to say before we go into the Apple bit, I just wanted to rewind a little bit. I was fascinated by your time at. Well, firstly, you said the Environmental Ballots something agency.
She
What does that mean? Like what because that's just that's the very jargony sort of like company title. What is that a government organization?
Oh, no, we were a nonprofit association, IRS 501(c)(3) educational organization funded by labor, business, and agriculture in the state of Minnesota.
Right.
And our mission was to balance economic, environmental, and energy needs for the people of Minnesota.
Right. And you mentioned that you had some pioneering approaches, I think, to dealing with sort of disputes and obviously unlocking those. I'm fascinated to that because I've certainly got a lot out of. I don't know if you've read it, Never Split the Difference. Chris Voss's book about negotiation. He was an ex FBI agent, I think, and so I'm fascinated by negotiation and dealing with disputes and how people manage to get people on side and really resolve them. What is your approach to negotiation and disputes?
Well, negotiation is different than mediation. Mediation is an independent third party. And what they try to do is talk to each of the parties in the dispute privately, gain their trust, understand what their goals and aspirations are, where their red lines are, where they're willing to give up, and then test out on each party potential solutions to at least part of the problem. Then once he or she knows that they're going to agree on some things, he brings the parties together, mediates that discussion to start first with those areas that they agree upon in order to develop mutual trust and then move on to those areas in which they don't agree. Negotiation, on the other hand, is just between two parties. And that's where one party tries to persuade the other party to accept their particular position or stance. And in negotiation, the key there is you have to get the other party to be involved to give up some assets or resources or time in order to gain their desire to be able to resolve the dispute.
But I presume there's kind of overlapping approaches and techniques to both of those things.
Yes.
And how do you approach the mediation then? How do you, give us some examples of when, you mentioned a couple of successful mediations. What techniques did you employ to, that you felt that made them successful and finding that resolution?
Well, the case of the Anheuser-Busch Bullhouse dispute, Anheuser-Busch wanted to build a malting facility outside Fargo, North Dakota, on the Moorhead, Minnesota side of the river. And it was opposed by a citizens group and the Minnesota Public Interest Research Group, which is the Ralph Nader spinoff. It was supported strongly by the state legislature, the state government, and the city of Moorhead. So first thing I did is I went to Moorhead and set up and had a meeting with the head of the citizens group. And I discovered in that meeting that he wasn't really opposed or supportive of the new development. He was using it as an excuse in order to get the respect of the mayor, who was quite arrogant and tended to piss him off. So I felt that if I could get it to the point where this leader of the citizens could get some respect from the mayor, that the whole thing would just fall apart and the construction of the plant could proceed. So I also met with the Minnesota Public Interest Group and their attorneys. I met with the mayor. I met with the state government. And then finally, I pulled all four groups together. We negotiated over the shape of the table that we would meet around. And this, by the way, is the same time that Henry Kissinger was trying to bring the Vietnam War to an end. And the first thing they did was negotiate over the shape and size of the table that they would sit at in Paris.
Why is that important?
It's your status is determined by where you're sitting. It's sort of a form of physical body language. So I suggested we just use a square table. We took 4 tables that were rectangular and created a square, and on each side was each of the 4 groups. And I stood in the middle as I mediated it, and or they went on the outside, and I had easels of paper set up with marking pens. And when somebody would say something, I would write it on the easel. So that eliminated people repeating themselves over and over again.
Mm.
They got acceptance of their particular point of view because I wrote it on that easel. And if someone else starts repeating themselves, I'd go over and point to it and say, "Hey, you guys already mentioned this already. Let's move on to the next point." I also arranged for all the television stations in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, which if I recall correctly, is like a couple hundred miles southeast of Moorhead, to send camera crews up there, reporters. And then we had the meeting in the gymnasium of the local high school, I think it was, and the public could come in and sit on the stands from this basketball court and watch the proceedings of this mediation. So we went on for several hours, and finally we adjourned with some areas of agreement, some areas of disagreement. And then I started the process again by talking to the head of the citizens, the mayor, the state, and the Minnesota Public Interest Group. And the citizen says, "Okay, I'm no longer interested in this thing." And I knew that was because he was seen at the same level as the mayor that refused to give him respect previously. So the citizens pulled out of the lawsuit. And the other thing remaining was the Public Interest Research Group. And I went to talk to the boss of the attorney that was pushing the dispute. And he told the attorney that we're going to withdraw the lawsuit, and the whole thing was resolved. The plant got built, created about 30 jobs. Every can of Budweiser on the West Coast now has malt in it from the plant that I helped get built.
Wow. So thinking about, I suppose, people out there that will be often dealing with difficult conversations and, essentially negotiations and disputes and mediation are all something that people experience in business every day. What, I suppose, advice would you give or guidance would you give for handling those? Any sort of techniques you would sort of advise people using?
Well, I teach in my classes and in my books, mediation and negotiation. And I found that my experiences of doing such was quite useful when I later became a product manager, or
Mm.
as I prefer to call them, a product success manager, because they're principally responsible for the success of the product. Because you've got competing objectives. The sales force has one set of objectives, support and service has another, the CFO has another, the CEO has another, the COO has another, training has another, uh, manufacturing has another.
Mm.
So a product success manager is constantly mediating between these different priorities in the organization in order to have a successful product. And got to keep in mind that conflict occurs. It's either man against nature, or man against himself. And it occurs because people either don't agree upon the problem, or if they do agree upon the problem, they can't agree upon the solution. Or if they can agree upon the problem and the solution, they might disagree on how they're going to go about achieving that solution. So you have to narrow whatever the conflict is and the dispute and the disagreements down to which of those areas. So if, for example, there's no agreement that there's a problem, then you got to get everyone to agree what the problem is, agree upon what the alternative solutions might be, agree upon which one of the alternative solutions would be the best one, and then agree upon how to go about implementing that particular solution. And that's what a product success manager does every day that they are on the job.
And obviously that sort of process that you've just talked through could be used in any situation
Yes,
in a business setting.
yes, and in your personal life.
Mm. Yeah, no, definitely. That's why I brought it up, because yeah, it's everything's negotiation, really, isn't it? And it's, negotiating with your kids, or negotiating with, your wife, where to go for dinner, or whatever, is it can come up, and obviously in more serious circumstances as well. I also had a question around, you know, just in the sort of initial part of your career, you've talked through and shared so far, you've gone from, aerospace, working with, a big sort of student population, to, working in environmental kind of mediation, to becoming going into politics, being a campaign manager, then moving into, um, the sort of technology sphere, and being a product manager.
Right.
But my observation of that's quite a lot of different industries and very different kind of positions. Do you think there's a thread, or is there a thread that runs through them, that kind of links them all to kind of together?
Well, my personal values drive me include getting things done. I like to accomplish things.
Mm.
So every morning I get up and make a list of things I want to get done that day. And I take a great deal of joy of crossing the items off that I've accomplished. A lot of people don't have that particular kind of drive. And so they don't know where they're at. They don't know where they want to go. And as a result, their life and their career just wanders from the path of least resistance to the next
Mm.
path of least resistance.
But is there a sort of, is the thing that links them all together that you were just wanting to get stuff done and wanting to, like, achieve things?
Correct.
There's nothing else that kind of, is there I don't know, a sort of skill set, or something that, a sort of area, or sort of task that is common to all of those different, like, industries and jobs that you had?
I think that's, from my standpoint, what was driving me. One of the things that I talk about is the importance of values, and that if
Mm.
you start a company, the most important first thing you do is
Mm.
come up with a set of values,
Mm.
and then you make sure everybody understands those values and follow it. You combine the values with a mission statement and goals, and then you've got a mission for your organization.
Mm,
That was the first thing I did with the Flying Club. That was the first thing I did with the Environmental Balance Association.
mm,
And that's why the Flying Club is still around here, 55 years later.
mm. Yeah, and that's an amazing sort of legacy, and I completely agree. It's, you've got to know where you're going as an organization. It's something that you can then communicate to your team and future team and your customers. So I know you had a few different sort of product failures that you could sort of talk about today. What do you think is or was the sort of most significant failure or product failure that you've kind of been involved with and witnessed?
Well, I started a company in the early 2000s called Maui Games. And the idea was to create games for your cell phone that had embedded advertising. And the idea was to be able to do development of these games on the island of Maui, which is quite a challenge, to be able to attract the talent that wants to live there, and so forth. So I invented the concept of a few games. One was Maui mountain biking, where you coast on your bike on your cell phone down the roads from the top of Haleakala, which is the highest mountain in the world, 30,000 feet, measured from the seafloor. And then if you fall off your bike and off the side of the mountain, then you'll say this crash was brought to you by Saucony running shoe or K1 bikes, who are some of the sponsors I got. And I developed a number of other little apps along with some of my employees and associates. One of them was called Encore Encore. It was a virtual cigarette lighter on your cell phone. So if you go to a concert and you want an encore, in the olden days, you would pull out your cigarette lighter and wave it back and forth. So now you can pull out your cell phone and wave it back and forth. It was such a successful product that the Los Angeles Times wrote a story about it and how people that went to a concert at the Hollywood Bowl, they wanted an encore, and they all pulled out their cell phones and were waving it back and forth. And then I did a virtual fireplace so that when you're out on a hot date eating dinner someplace, you can pull out your cell phone and put your virtual fireplace on your phone and have a very romantic dinner. If you don't like a fireplace, that was called Light My Fire. You could turn on Candelabra, which is a virtual set of candles that you would put on your dinner table at the restaurant. Well, I was told by Nokia at the time that the Nokia cell phone had the largest installation or install base in the world, and I didn't bother to check where in the world they had those cell phones until after I'd spent all my money developing these games, including frisbee football and Maui golf, where you can play the golf courses in Maui on your cell phone. And my sales force that I put together to sell ads in these games was in the United States, but my ad inventory was in Europe because there was a mechanism there where I could give these things away for free. So I had a disconnect, and that was a mistake I made in not doing my market research in terms of figuring out what target phones I should go on, because I found out later that there was only 2 Nokia phones for sale in the United States, and both of them did not have the computing capability to play any of my games. So I had a sales force in the United States, ad inventory in Europe. US advertisers had little interest in advertising in Europe, so Maui Games went out of business. And this was before the iPhone came out, which would have been a perfect platform for what I was doing. So the big mistake I made is I didn't do adequate market research. And the second mistake I made is I had to find 15 unmet needs over what people want to do. And once you find 15 unmet needs, then you know the window of opportunity is opening up for your product. I was to that market. In fact, I was given credit by RCN magazine, which was following the telecommunications industry, that I was the first one to ship an ad on a cell phone. And when I tried to raise some angel capital, the guy that started the Whole Earth catalog or something like that out of Berkeley, he was one of the angel investors that sat in that meeting up in Napa where I made my business plan presentation. And he stood up. He says, nobody wants ads on their cell phone. So Forget about it. Well, he didn't know what he's talking about. Here we now have ads all over our cell
Yeah.
phones.
Yeah.
So because I was so far ahead of my time, I didn't have enough resources to stay in business until the market finally developed. So the two mistakes is not knowing when I have identified 15 unmet needs that my product or my service would fulfill. And second, not satisfactorily doing market research in depth.
Do you think that your games company, I mean, you said it yourself, and it was the thought I had. It sounded like it was kind of ahead of its time. Do you think it would have been successful if it was a few years later?
Yeah, I think it would have been successful if we came out with the products shortly after the first iPhone was introduced. And the reason being is in the early days of a new device like that, there's very relatively little things that you can do with it. For example, when I was at Apple, the Macintosh was finally introduced, and and only 128K of memory, no hard disk drive, one floppy drive, and there was very little you could do with the Mac in those early days. And in fact, it was so bad that Mac sales dropped to 4 units in January of 1985. And that was a great deal responsible for why Steve Jobs got fired and had to leave Apple in 1985. Uh, and I had left Apple by that point in time and was working for a company that had a text to speech software called Smooth Talker, and you could type stuff into your Mac and it would speak back to you, which was quite revolutionary at the time. And because I had relationships as being the Apple III group product manager and later the Apple III business unit manager, I had relationships with about 1,800 dealers personally around the world. And I was able to convince them to buy Smooth Talker and sell it alongside the Mac when people first bought it. And then I did some market research to find out were they using Smooth Talker to read spreadsheets back to people so they could confirm their entries, or to read word processing documents back to proofread it, that kind of thing, which is what we are advocating to be done with Smooth Talker. Turned out what they would do is they would put the Mac on a kitchen table during a party, and people could come up and type in swear words just to hear the computer swear out. And we sold $1.2 million worth of software merely out of humor, parties, and swearing.
Was that a success or a failure? Um, so yeah, talking about your time at Apple, I mean, I know that you worked on quite a few different sort of product lines, and you witnessed some of the failures that they had with, the Apple Lisa you mentioned, and I think the Apple, one of the original Apple Macintosh. Can you tell us about some of those experiences, particularly with the Lisa? Because I think the history there is, it was a very there's lots of, let's put it this way, there's lots of politics from what I understand involved in the Lisa.
Yeah, after I'd successfully introduced the hard drive I mentioned earlier in the profile, the systems group asked me to come over to be the Group 3 Apple III product manager. And I agreed, and I said, but there have been rumors floating around the company that guys wanted to cancel the product line. And they assured me that no, I would have an 18-month runway to make the product even more successful. At that point in time, the Apple III was the third most popular computer in terms of units in the world. First was the Apple II, then the DEC mini computer, PDP-11, and then the Apple III. Well, Steve Jobs went off with the executive committee to Pajara Dunes, California, down by Monterey, and he convinced them to cancel the Apple III product line because he wanted that market space for his beloved Macintosh, which he had not yet shipped and he had not yet produced. So they canceled the product line. And a week or so later, I was coming out of the corporate headquarters on Mariani along De Anza Boulevard in Cupertino, and the marketing manager, Ida Cole, for the division ran out and grabbed me. And she later went on to be international vice president and very wealthy at Microsoft. And she says, John wants to talk to you. And I said, John, who? And she says, John Scully, the president. I said, oh, yeah, I know him. I met him a couple of times. So she ushered me into a little conference room off his office. John was sitting at the end of the table holding a SuperCalc, VisiCalc spreadsheet. And he said, urged me to sit down in this seat. Across from me was Ida. Kitty corner for me was Del Yoakum, the VP of manufacturing, later president of Apple. And on my left was Joe Graziano, the chief financial officer, who later left Apple, became the CFO for Sun Microsystems, then came back to Apple later. Was very helpful in the success of Apple in the last 20 years. And John says to me, we just found out that, we canceled the product line and we got $20 million in piece parts spread across our manufacturing facilities in Singapore and Dallas and Cork Island. What should we do? I've been trying to affect sales on a dealer floor from my position as the group product manager in the personal systems group. And I put together a promotion, which I then took to another promotions group inside the division, who then took it to a promotions group at corporate marketing, who then took it to a marketing group in marketing, who then took it to the Salesforce principals, who then took it to our manufacturing reps principals, because we use manufacturing reps and distributors, who then took it to their salespeople that call on the dealers, who then took it to the principal leader of the dealer, who then in turn would pass the promotion on to the individual salesperson. I said, John, I'm 8 levels removed from affecting that transaction on the floor. And one of the things I did when I joined Apple from HP is I took a part-time job as a computer salesman in a computer store in Fremont, California, near where I lived, just to see what's going on there at the other end of where a product manager is trying to get there done. So I said, give me the authority commensurate with the responsibility for the product line, and we'll sell these things. He says, I said, we need an independent business unit to get this done. And then I told him the story of Alpha General, I think it was, with the new soul of a new machine, their experience. I told him the story of the IBM PC, which was constantly shot down in corporate headquarters in Schenectady, New York, because the IBM salespeople were afraid it was going to cannibalize their commission checks. So IBM moved the headquarters for the PC development to Boca Raton, Florida, as far away from Schenectady they could get while still staying in the United States and in the same time zone. And I said they were able to develop the product and bring it to market. And I told him of my friend back in the supersonic transport days, a fellow by the name of Kelly Johnson, who headed up the Lockheed Skunk Works down in the Palm Desert of Southern California. And he and his team could develop an advanced aircraft like the SR-71, the X-1, the X-15 in like 18 months, while the rest of the company, the rest of Lockheed, would take 7 years to get the same thing done. And he says, okay, make me a proposal. So I gathered data up from about 80 people in the company that were able to contribute. 7 to 12 of us got together, wrote an 80-page business plan. And then we presented the business plan to the executive committee on July 15th, 1983, a day that will live in infamy, at least in my mind. And one of the people that helped me with it was a lady by the name of Martha, for their last name offhand, Griffin or something. She had been on the Apple values committee several years earlier to develop values for Apple. She says, in addition to doing the typical business plan balance sheet on the P&L, profit and loss for the product line, let's also compare the alternatives we're giving the executive committee to Apple values, knowing full well that Apple values included empathy for our customer, achievement, aggressiveness, positive social contribution, individual performance, team spirit, innovation, individual growth, quality, excellence, and most importantly, good management. So we compared those things, and then the climax of the meeting came with Floyd Kwame, who was in the meeting, Executive Vice President of Marketing and Sales, says, Dave, if we pick the option that you're recommending, that is let the market decide, or we pick the option of shutting the product line down as the executive committee had done a month or so ago, and a dealer called you, what would you say? Well, the notion of let the market decide came from a trip I took when I was in aerospace engineering at Michigan. I think it was the Apollo 15 or maybe the Apollo 16 launch was all University of Michigan aerospace engineering graduates, all three astronauts. And they are about to fly to the moon from uh, Cape Canaveral. And so the department chartered a jet and flew all of us down to Cape Canaveral to witness the launch. And after the launch, they took us by bus over to Disney World, which was under construction at the time. And we got a lecture from the chief Imagineer. Disney doesn't call their engineers engineers, they call them Imagineer, combining innovation with engineering. And at that meeting, one of my fellow students asked what I thought was one of the stupidest questions I've ever heard in my life. He asked the chief Imagineers, how did you guys decide where to put the sidewalks at Disney World? And I laughed, and everybody else in the room laughed, and the chief Imagineer didn't laugh. He says, that's a very good question. He said, the 100 Imagineers on Disney World argued about that for 3 days. And finally, one of the junior Imagineers recommended we not put any sidewalks in, just plant grass, wait about 3 weeks and see where people walk, put sidewalks in there. In other words, let the market decide because they're not smart enough to know where people are going to walk. And it was kind of funny when I was researching this book, Building and Sailing Great Products. I don't know if you can see it there.
Yeah.
Which is available on Amazon. Just look up my name on Amazon.
Put it in the show notes.
Yeah. I went to look at pictures on Google of Disney World today. And the funny thing is there's no grass anywhere. It was all concrete or asphalt because apparently people just couldn't stay out of the hedges and out of the grass. So coming back to the discussion with Kwame, I said, well, if you guys decide to keep the product line and let the market decide when the product line would be ended, and I didn't know it at the time, but the Apple III was what the Boston Consulting Group later would define as a cash cow. All the R&D had been spent, and all we needed to do was market, sell it, manufacture it, support it, and we just make a lot of money off of it. I said, if that's what you decide, I'll tell the dealer that. And so long as you continue to sell it, we'll continue to support it, develop it, and so forth. I said, but if you guys decide to cancel the product line, I would tell the dealer to give you a call. And everybody laughed because they knew that was such conflict with the values of the company. And I didn't know it at the time, but Ann Noyce was sitting in the back, Ann Bowers, who was married to Bill Noyce at Intel. She was the VP of HR at Intel and at Apple at the same time. And Ann, I think, was primarily responsible for getting the company to get a committee together to pull together a set of values patterned loosely over Intel's values, which was patterned loosely after HP's values called the HP way. So about a week later, I got a call, asked if I would be the independent business unit manager of a newly formed Apple III division, independent from the personal computer systems group. So, and I wrote 17 people, $4 million I could spend in budget. I could sign checks for $200,000, which today I think maybe about $2 million, and do anything I want.
So you succeeded basically in your argument.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I said, so I'll be the general manager of the Apple III. They said, no, we can't make you the general manager. We'll make you the business manager, business unit manager. I said, great, I'm bum. And we went out and sold the 17 of us 25,000 Apple IIIs, produced enough profits to keep 1,000 to 1,500 Apple employees still employed until I shut the product line down and until Steve canceled the Lisa product line, whose development started in the same room at the same time as the Apple III. And they didn't ship until like 3 or 4 years later after the Apple III, and produced enough money to help fund the development of Steve's beloved Mac. If Steve was successful in shutting the product line down in the spring of 1983, he would not have had the money to build the Mac and develop the Mac, and 1,000 to 1,500 Apple employees would have lost their jobs within a few months. And certainly by January through the spring of 1985, after the Mac sales dropped to 4 units and Steve canceled the Lisa just to get it out of his line of fire there. Uh, uh, he got fired due to the lack of sales. And one of the reasons that Lisa failed is they didn't properly position the product in the market. It was an office computer, but they did not allow anybody else to write software for it. Yet the success of the Apple II and the success of the Apple III was to allow third-party developers to develop products for it and spend their money that Apple didn't have, and spend their innovation on making the Apple II and the Apple III into other things that nobody at Apple could have ever thought of, and thus enhancing and expanding on the marketing and the sales of the core product. Steve did the same thing. When he came back, he learned his lesson, and he allowed the iPhone to be open and set it up so developers could develop a product for the iPhone and for the iPad. And in my case, for the Apple III, I had not only the central processor unit, but I also had 500 other Apple-developed and or third-party developed hardware and software products, all out there trying to sell their stuff with the Apple III.
In terms of like the Lisa, what sort of lessons did or can we, sharing with the listeners, can people learn from, from that failure? Because obviously it was quite a high profile failure in terms of the product. And obviously, that was, from what I understand at the time, Steve Jobs' kind of, baby. And yeah, it kind of fell flat on its face in the end. So,
Well,
yeah,
it was not his baby. He only became the manager of the Lisa until 1985.
right,
Lisa development started back probably around 1978.
right.
Steve did probably bring the mouse concept to the Lisa and the graphical user interface. But the first mistake they made is in January of 1983, they announced the Lisa at the stock holders annual meeting, and the product was not ready to ship. They didn't ship it till like August or September of 1983. By that point in time, people had gone out and ordered a Lisa from a dealer because they were really excited based upon the hype that Apple was able to put together. In fact, I was at the first Worldwide Developers Conference for Apple in May of 1983, and John Couch, C-O-U-C-H, the general manager, came in, and he carried a suitcase in, and he opened up the suitcase and started pulling out one magazine after another where Apple's PR agency, Regis Paquetto, was able to get the Lisa on the cover. So dealers or companies and people that wanted to buy this thing for $10,000 placed an order if their dealer couldn't get it. So they placed an order at another dealer. They couldn't get it. So they placed an order at another dealer. So the instant that the Lisa started shipping, order backlog shrunk by 2/3. And I know that to be a fact because I sat on the sales forecasting committee with the Couch's representative for the Lisa and also for the Apple II, and we would then forecast what our sales were going to be so Del Yokin would know how many of each to build. So sales dried up by 2/3 immediately after that. The product was priced at $10,000. There was very little you could do with it other than the software that Apple had written for it, which was quite weak compared to other products that were on the market at the time, like WordPerfect and databases and accounting packages and things like that. And the product was $10,000, and people couldn't figure out what to use it for. It's too
Oh, for
expensive.
$10,000 as well is like, this is in the 80s, so I don't know what the equivalent to that would be now.
Yeah, probably, I don't know, 30 or 40,000, maybe more. At the same time, the Apple II was selling for 2,000. The IBM PC was that same ballpark. The Apple III was selling for 3,000 plus the hard drive. And people didn't know what they could do with it. It turned out that when I researched it, that the number one thing people were using it for is to make overhead transparencies or foils. Up until then, the only way you could make a foil for an overhead projector was to get an order ball on your selectric typewriter and type it out that way. But with Lisa, you could do graphics and you could do large fonts and print these things for your presentations. So one or more should have been sold into the graphics department of every company in the United States, and that alone would have made the product successful. But the marketing people at Lisa were not smart enough to understand what the market was going to do.
Is the lesson there then that essentially the product was built not knowing who the actual target client was?
That's correct. They did not understand what problems of what people wanted to do that the product would solve. They didn't bother to research it to that level in that division. But it turns out that Jenny Saul, who was in the market research division at corporate, we had about 50 market researchers at the time, did know this. It gave reports to the executive committee that the way the product was going to be sold, marketed, priced, and so forth was incorrect, and it was not going to be successful in the marketplace. She later went on to do the market research for Intuit, which resulted in the business accounting package called QuickBooks, which has been very successful over the last 30 years. So to come back to understanding what it is that your customer wants to do, and when you do that research, you also pick up the demographics, the genographics, the firmographics on your customers so that you can develop a persona of who you're building the product for. When I took over the Apple III as the product manager, the first thing I did was go talk to Jeff Raskin, one of the chief architects on the Apple III. I said, none of these MBAs in corporate or the division marketing can tell me what the market is for the product. Who did you make this thing for? And he told me explicitly that it was for small and medium business and for office applications, word processing, spreadsheets, graphics, databases, accounting, things like that, which are things that the Apple II struggled doing because it did not have a hard disk drive at the time. It also didn't even have a uppercase letter, so you couldn't type a sentence without turning yourself into a pretzel to hold the appropriate keys to get an uppercase letter. Jeff later went on to be the chief architect of the Macintosh, and because he was competing with Steve, who was banned from all of Apple and sent off into the corner on this little project called the Macintosh, Steve then let Jeff go and continued to develop it with his pirate ship and a pirate flag that he flew outside of his offices over on Stevens Creek. After Steve went on to have his last computer failure called Next, made the same mistakes as Lisa with a computer that was actually a mainframe on your desk. And the target market was university professors that didn't like standing in line for the mainframe computers to run their computer programs. They could run it on their desk for $10,000. You mispositioned the product. That product failed. And then again, in research for my book, I found that he probably sat down with the founder of HP, Dave Packard, who I also used to handle personal PR for when I was in corporate PR at HP. And Dave explained to him that you should not be afraid to cannibalize your old product, because if you don't do it, somebody else will. And sure enough, when he went on to, came back to Apple in the late 90s, and developed the notion of the iPod, the thought of having music in your pocket, and then the iPhone, which had an iPod built in. He was not afraid to put a music iPod-like player into the iPhone, which meant that he learned that it's okay to cannibalize his own product. And sure enough, Apple, out of that vision and following Apple values, which they follow to today, they became the most valuable company in the world.
What was Steve Jobs' approach to failure like?
I don't know. There was two Steve Jobs, the one that I knew, and then the one that came back to Apple. The one that I knew would berate people that made mistakes, almost to the point of causing them to cry. I think when he came back, he tended to hold people up as heroes and just ask them, I think, what did you learn from that mistake? Let's see how we can do things better. And that's a form of innovation that you see that came out of the industrial designers at Apple and Johnny Ive. where it's been written that Steve would meet with them every Wednesday and they would unveil prototypes of what they're thinking. And it's like the iPhone, and Steve would pick it up and handle it, touch it, feel it, or work with it. And I don't know if you ever took the case off of your iPhone and held it. It feels wonderful compared to other products. Well, that's one of the things, the feel of the product, the out of box experience that we all have when we get an Apple product is like a little jewel that's been preciously preserved and tucked away. There's a great deal of focus on that aspect of design, which in part goes back to Steve's love of calligraphy and fonts.
Mm. But when, when he worked on things that didn't, succeed, there were commercial failures, what, in your experience, was the reaction from him?
Well, I was quite successful, as I mentioned before, with the Apple III. But one story that's related to that is in the spring of '83, no, spring of '84, I was traveling with one of our manufacturing reps calling on dealers in Southern California. And I get a call early in the week from Ken Zerber. He says, we want you to come back to corporate and meet with the executive committee and explain why you can't cancel the Apple III Plus introduction and shipment of the follow-on product to the Apple III. And nothing pisses me off more than being called out of the field, like off the front lines, go in the back and fight with the bureaucrats over what's going on. We had already introduced the Apple III Plus at Compex a week or so before. And then day before, I think the meeting with the executive committee was like Friday. The day before, like on Thursday, I got an email through Apple Mail, Apple Link, the app email system. One of the reasons for Apple's early success is that it had its own internal email system. Only 200 companies in the world had internal email. Actually, 3: DEC, HP, and IBM. So it was really easy to communicate with each other and with our dealers. So I got an email from the head of sales, and he says to me, or asked me, why can't you cancel the Apple III Plus introduction? So I wrote back to him knowing that he did not use Apple email. He probably dictated or hand wrote his messages, handed it to his secretary who typed it up and stuck it on Apple Link. So I knew he knew nothing about the capabilities of Apple Link. So I wrote back to him and says, I'm really sorry, Gene. We can't cancel the introduction because the email introduction has already been written and it's in the system and it's scheduled to be released on Friday morning. And there's nothing I can do about it. I can't recall. It doesn't have the capability to cancel or recall a previously written and scheduled email. And he didn't argue with me, but he didn't know. Then about 10 years ago, I saw Gene again at an Apple reunion for the first 10 years of Apple employees. And I went up to him. I said, Gene, I need to apologize. He said, what do you need to apologize for? I told him that I lied to him, that that capability was there when it really wasn't. But I had to get the email out because my responsibility was to sell that inventory of Apple IIIs. And if I canceled the 3 Plus introduction, the questions that the dealers would ask about support of the product line would cause them to just dump their inventory and lose the loyalty of their Apple customers and of their employees. Or so I beg for your forgiveness. And he put his hand on my shoulder. And he says, I forgive you, my son. So there I turned what potentially could have been an unmitigated disaster into a success.
What can people in the audience learn from Steve Jobs, from what you saw of him and how he interacted and the things that he brought to Apple?
Well, like I said, there was 2 Steve Jobs, the good one and the bad one. And we had a little meeting of Apple employees back in the early 2000s. And I said at the time that if the good Steve Jobs was at Apple when the bad Steve Jobs was there, the company would be 3 times larger than it is today. And then after the good Steve Jobs came back to Apple and did all the things right, The company is 3 times more valuable than it was before he came back. It was about to go out of business in the late 1990s.
What was the good points that he brought then? What was the difference between, like, as you said, the good and the bad?
Well, he talked about it a lot that we are a company that has a set of values and we follow those values. And the reason that's important is that if you do that, when people go into a meeting, everybody in the meeting knows what the values are around the decisions that that meeting subject is around. Whereas if you went into a meeting where there are no values or the values are not followed, that some people may be following Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, profit at all costs, and everything else will take care of itself, including the employees and the customers. If some people were thinking that way, where others were thinking empathy for the customer, it would be very difficult to have a consensus, make the right decisions, and everybody be pulling in the same direction.
So did when he was bad, Steve Jobs, did you not have those? Did Apple not have those values?
We had the values, but he himself did not follow those
Right.
values.
And that's a leadership lesson, right? If you've got core values that you've got from people from the top have got to follow them.
Absolutely. Yeah, when he set up his Macintosh group, he flew the pirate flag outside. We are the pirates. He encouraged the Macintosh team, marketing team, and others to not interact with the rest of the company. He treated the Apple III people and the Apple II people like garbage. And in fact, the former group product manager for the Apple II, told me that Steve tried to cancel the Apple II product line. And he treated his people like pirates and like heroes, even to the point when the Mac was introduced on January 24th, 1984, over at De Anza College. Nobody from the rest of the company was invited to it. And in fact, when they had their reunion just this past January, 40 years later, none of the people that were the rest of the company funding his development of the product were invited to go to that reunion. So he actually split the company into two parts, drastically compromising the concept of teamwork, which I mentioned is one of the keys of Apple values.
So just starting to wrap up, what advice would you give to listeners who might have experienced a setback or failure within their business?
Go back to understanding what it is that your customer wants to do, how they want to do it, when they want to do it, where they want to do it, what's standing in their way, how important is it, how satisfied are they with the current way of getting things done. If you clearly understand that, then as part of that, you'll find out where people go to get information about your product, uh, what they'd be willing to pay for it, how it should then be distributed and sold, and how it should be positioned in the marketplace, along with the marketing messages, the minimum viable product, and the value proposition. And you should be listening for this stuff all the time to see if there's any changes going on, so that you can adjust and change according to whatever is happening. A number of businesses during COVID adjusted. For example, food moved quickly from in-house dining to carry out to food delivery, and restaurants that adjusted that way survived, and those that could not adjust are no longer with us.
That's great advice. If you could turn back time and, thinking about the games company that the failure that happened, and have erased that from ever happening, would you do that?
Yeah, I would have continued to study the market by myself and waited until a more powerful phone like the iPhone came out,
Mm.
and talk to more customers, observe what more customers are doing. And where you understand what it is that your customers want to do is you first observe like a social anthropologist. And I learned that from my mediation days, that you understand what the issues are in a dispute by first observing what's going on. Then you interview, then you do a survey with a representative sample. Then if you're lucky enough to have big data or analytics or artificial intelligence, you could use that to help analyze the data that covers human behavior, customer behavior. But one of the caveats that I put on that is The whole notion of big data is what's called wisdom of the crowds, which came out of computer science at Stanford back in the 90s. It's the basis for the recommendation engines at Netflix and at Amazon, and it's the basis for the recommendations that Google uses in the Google search. Well, if the crowd is so wise, how come every now and then a crowd goes into a bar with a band, a fire breaks out, and everybody tries to get out the same door at the same time, and many of them perish as a result of following the wisdom of the crowd? Well, in reality, what they should do is think it through and realize that there's an entrance behind the stage, and that's the direction I would go in the event of a fire in a bar.
But do you wish that failure of that company had never happened?
Yes, because it turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry. One of the companies that was independent selling ads on cell phones was acquired by Apple for like $10 billion.
Wow.
Will be extremely rich if I hadn't, if I knew then what I know now. Just want to add another little story about why wisdom of the crowds, recommendation engines, and by the way, Meta, Facebook, is using your posts and your behavior on Facebook and Instagram in order to train its artificial intelligence engine. And I don't know if you know there was a Facebook post accusing Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, of eating their neighbors' pets. And then the lady that posted that found their cat in their basement the next day, erased the post, but by that time it had gone viral all the way up to the vice presidential candidate and Donald Trump's presidential debate, talking about that as it is true. So we got to be very careful as to what data is being used to train our generative AI engines. And the same way that the story goes that Henry Ford, when he was thinking about building an affordable car, went out on the streets of Dearborn, not far from where I grew up in Detroit. And allegedly he asked people, would you like to have a car? And they said, I have no idea what a car is, but what I want is a faster horse. Well, if you just sat on a stoop in one of the saloons in Dearborn with a beer in his hand, he would have noticed people whipping their horses trying to get through town faster. So the proper question is, would you like to have a faster horse? And of course you would, and we'll just call it a horseless carriage. And he went on to be successful. So you can't ask people what they want. You can't ask people what they prefer, what they would need, but you can ask them and observe them in terms of what they do, a more granular form of jobs to be done and outcome-based innovation.
Amazing. So we always end on a quick fire round. So this is short questions and short answers. So question 1, failure is?
Acceptable, and it's how you're going to learn so long as you don't put the company out of business.
What's your life's mission?
Right now, I found that about 35% of all new products developed fail in the marketplace, representing about $1 trillion in waste each year. And my mission is to teach the 5 keys to product success in my courses, in my consulting, and in my books to reduce that amount of product failure. Because if we could do that, then a lot more people could be fed, the environment could be taken care of, and the ability to pay people more would become easier. So that's my mission. Product
Amazing.
success.
What's one piece of advice that you'd give to people on your deathbed?
Care about others. Take care of others and the environment.
What's one habit that keeps you resilient?
I think cooking. I love to cook.
Nice. If you could be immortal and live forever, would you take it and why?
Probably because I enjoy living. I enjoy helping others. I enjoy getting things done. And by being mortal, I'm not able to continue doing that. But in a small way, these kinds of podcasts, my books, and my courses will continue to live on.
Absolutely. If you could swap places with any other business person in the world, who would it be?
Oh, geez. Would certainly not be well, yeah, I would. I would like to take Elon Musk's job over, so we could turn Twitter back into an unbiased, non-spreader of lies.
I think a lot of people would probably agree with you. So, David, where can people find you and connect with you?
They can go to my website, which is spicecatalyst.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search for my name on LinkedIn and become part of my network. They can send me an email to dave@spicecatalyst.com. They can go to Amazon and look up my name as an author of the books that I have up there. Go to my website to learn about my on-demand online training.
Brilliant. I will put all that in the show notes. So, David, thanks so much for sharing a plethora of stuff today from your years and years of experience and some amazing stories, and some great advice, about products and how to, better listen to your customers. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for putting up with me.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Fail. Really hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new. Please do subscribe to the show and leave us a review. It really does help us to grow and to reach more people. Do follow us on social media too. We're at Jeswood on Instagram and at Beyond the Fail on YouTube and also on Linktree. Thanks again and see you soon.